Did you honestly think I wouldn't feel it, David? Lisa's voice barely rose above a whisper, yet the quiet devastation in her tone seemed to fracture the heavy oak doors of the king's study. David didn't turn. His broad shoulders remained rigidly squared toward the rain-lashed window, the sharp silhouette of the Alpha King carved against the storm. It was necessary for the pack, Lisa. An alliance. Politics. Politics, she repeated, the word tasting like ash. Her hand dropped to her stomach, shielding the secret fluttering there, a secret he no longer deserved. You marked Elena in front of thousands. You bound your soul to hers. Tell me, David, does your politics bleed into the bond? He finally faced her, his eyes a tormented, stormy silver. But Lisa had already turned away, walking out the door and out of his reign. The scent hit her before the whispers did. Lisa had spent the morning in the sunlit archives of the High Court, her hands trembling slightly over ancient ledgers. The nausea had been worse today, a persistent ache that radiated from her core, a biological drumbeat reminding her of the impossible. A royal heir, the first in 3 generations. A child conceived on the edge of a fading mate bond, born of a desperate, fleeting reconciliation 3 months prior. She had planned to tell him tonight. She had arranged the dinner, selected the wine he favored, even worn the sapphire silk he once said mirrored the twilight in her eyes. But as she stepped into the grand marble foyer of the Citadel, the air was wrong. It wasn't just the stifling silence that fell over the gathered courtiers as she entered. It was the olfactory assault. Underneath the scent of polished stone and winter blooms, a sharp, cloying sweetness lingered. Jasmine and crushed berries. Elena's scent, and woven into it, inextricably linked and radiating dominance, was the dark pine and ozone signature of Alpha King David. It wasn't merely the scent of proximity. It was the pungent, unmistakable metallic tang of a claiming mark. Lisa froze, her hand gripping the cold wrought iron of the banister. A young emissary nearby hurriedly averted his gaze, his face pale. The silence in the hall was absolute, save for the rhythmic, agonizing thud of Lisa's own heart. "My lady," came a low voice beside her. It was Marcus, the captain of the guard, his usually impassive face etched with a grim sorrow. "Perhaps you should return to your chambers." "The king," he faltered, a rare occurrence for the seasoned warrior. "The king, what, Marcus?" Lisa's voice was remarkably steady, belying the chasm opening beneath her feet. "The king held a public assembly in the square an hour ago," Marcus said, his words measured, heavy. He announced an alliance with the Northern Territories, sealed it with the old rites. The old rites, a public marking, a declaration not just of political unity, but of spiritual and physical binding. Lisa didn't scream. She didn't collapse. The training of a high-born wolf, the discipline drilled into her since childhood, took over. She straightened her spine, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt. "I see," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. "Thank you, Marcus." She walked back the way she came, her steps measured, betraying nothing. It wasn't until she reached the sanctuary of her private rooms, locking the heavy oak door behind her, that the facade cracked. She sank to the floor, the cold stone biting into her knees, and finally let out a choked, tearless sob. Her hand pressed instinctively to her abdomen. The life inside her, a microscopic flicker of royal lineage, was a stark contrast to the death of the bond she felt severing in her chest. A mate bond was a living thing, nurtured by proximity and intent. To mark another while the true mate lived was an act of profound violence to the soul. David had always been a pragmatist, a king who weighed the survival of his people above all else. The northern territories were wealthy, ruthless, and threatening succession. An alliance with Elena, the Northern Alpha's daughter, secured borders and resources. But Lisa had always believed, naively perhaps, that their bond, frayed and tested as it was by the crown's weight, held a sanctity he wouldn't violate. She had been wrong. A sharp knock broke her reverie. Lisa, it was him. The resonance of his voice vibrated through the wood, a low rumble that usually settled her nerves. Now, it sparked a visceral revulsion. She didn't answer. She stood, brushing off her skirt, moving to the vanity mirror. She looked pale, her dark eyes hollowed out, but her jaw was set. Lisa, open the door. The command in his tone was undeniable, the alpha edge bleeding through. I am indisposed, Your Majesty, she called out, her voice remarkably even. The title tasted bitter. A long silence followed. She could hear his breathing on the other side, slow and deliberate. She could sense the conflict in him, the dark swirl of his aura pressing against the boundary of her room. We need to speak, he said, his voice dropping the command, replacing it with a weary resignation. There is nothing left to say, she replied, turning her back to the door. The actions in the square spoke volumes enough. She heard his heavy footsteps retreat down the corridor. He had retreated. For now. Lisa moved to her desk, pulling out a plain, leather-bound satchel. The Citadel, once her home, had become a cage of humiliation. She could not stay and watch him build a life, a reign, with another woman while carrying his secret heir. The child would become a pawn, a threat, or worse, a bargaining chip in David's endless game of politics. She began to pack, selecting only the essentials. Her movements were swift, driven by a cold, settling resolve. The Alpha King had made his choice for the pack. Now, Lisa would make hers for her child. The escape was less dramatic than a betrayal. Yet it carried a heavier finality. Lisa waited until the Citadel slept, the deep, rhythmic breathing of a fortress, unaware of the fracturing within its walls. She avoided the main corridors, navigating the servant passages and forgotten alcoves she had mapped out during her lonely first years at court. She wore simple woolen traveling clothes, her hair tucked beneath a dark hood. The satchel slung across her chest felt light, containing only a few changes of clothes, some hidden currency, and the necessary herbs to mask her scent. The most important thing she carried was unseen, nestled securely within her womb. The rain had started just past midnight, a cold, driving sleet that washed away tracks and dampened scents. It was a blessing disguised as misery. As she slipped through the postern gate, a shadow detached itself from the wall. Lisa froze, her hand dropping to the small silver blade hidden in her boot. You're leaving. It was Marcus. He stood in the down-through unbothered by the cold, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't wear his captain's insignia. He was in plain, dark leathers. I am, Lisa said, keeping her hand near her weapon. She knew Marcus's loyalty to David was absolute. Marcus sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of the Citadel's stones. I cannot stop you. If I try, I suspect you'll fight me, and I have no desire to hurt you, my lady. Then let me pass. Where will you go? He asked, stepping slightly aside, but not entirely clearing the path. The Northern Alliance means the borders are tight. Elena's people are already moving in. That is my concern, Lisa replied, her tone brooking no argument. Tell him nothing. Let him believe whatever is easiest for his conscience. Marcus looked at her, his eyes searching her face in the gloom. His gaze flicked, briefly and almost imperceptibly, to her midsection. He was a skilled tracker, attuned to subtle shifts in scent and aura. Lisa stiffened. "I will report that I found the postern gate unsecured," Marcus said quietly, deliberately looking away from her stomach, "and that the storm washed away any scent trails." Relief, sharp and unexpected, pierced her. "Why, Marcus?" "Because," he said, turning back to face the citadel, "I swore an oath to serve the crown. But I also swore an oath to protect the innocent. Some politics are too foul, even for a soldier." He walked away, his dark form disappearing into the rain. Lisa didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the citadel grounds and into the unforgiving night, the cold wind biting through her cloak. She had a destination in mind, a small, isolated pack in the deep southern valleys, neutral territory that had long resisted the king's influence, a place where a solitary wolf claiming widowhood might disappear. The journey was brutal. The morning sickness struck with vengeance the next day, forcing her to shelter in a damp cave while her body rejected the meager rations she had brought. She pushed through the exhaustion, relying on pure, stubborn will. She masked her scent religiously with the crushed herbs, knowing David's trackers would eventually be unleashed. Days bled into a week. She avoided main roads, traveling mostly at night. The physical toll was immense, but the mental strain was worse. The severed mate bond throbbed like a phantom limb, a constant, dull ache in her chest. She could feel faint echoes of David, bursts of anger, spikes of cold calculation, filtered through the damaged connection. He was searching for her. Not out of love, she reasoned, but out of possessiveness. An alpha did not lose what was his without a fight, even if he had discarded it. On the 8th day, her strength gave out. She was navigating a steep incline near the border of the southern valleys when a wave of dizziness hit her. The world tilted dangerously. She tried to grab a passing branch, but her fingers slipped on the wet bark. She fell, sliding down the muddy embankment, hitting rocks and roots until she slammed into the base of a massive oak tree. Pain flared in her side, sharp and breath-stealing. She lay there, gasping, rain mixing with the dirt on her face. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her. The baby. She curled her arms around her stomach, waiting for the dreaded warmth of blood, the cramp that signaled the end. Minutes passed. The pain in her side dulled to an ache, but her womb remained quiet. A shaky breath escaped her. "Well, little one," she whispered to the empty forest, "it seems we are both stubborn." She tried to push herself up, but a sharp agony radiated from her ankle. It was twisted, perhaps broken. She was miles from any settlement, injured and vulnerable. As twilight descended, painting the woods in shadows, she heard the snap of a twig. It wasn't the rhythmic rustle of an animal. It was the deliberate, heavy tread of a wolf in human form. Lisa fumbled for her silver blade, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed herself back against the oak, trying to blend into the darkness. The footsteps stopped a few yards away. The wind shifted, carrying a scent to her. It wasn't the metallic tang of David's trackers, nor the aggressive musk of rogue wolves. It was wood smoke, old leather, and a hint of chamomile. A figure stepped into the clearing, illuminated faintly by the rising moon. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver streaking his dark hair. He wore the rough-spun clothes of a southerner. He stopped, his gaze locking onto her huddled form. "You're a long way from home, little wolf," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. Lisa raised her blade, her hand shaking. "Stay back." The man held up his hands, showing they were empty. "I mean, you no harm. I'm Elias, the alpha of the Silver Creek pack. He paused, his nostrils flaring slightly. His eyes narrowed, taking in her bruised face, her defensive posture, and finally, settling on her midsection. "And you are running from something far worse than the storm." Elias didn't ask questions. He didn't push for her lineage or the reason she smelled vaguely of crushed sage and profound sorrow. He saw a pregnant woman with a ruined ankle shivering against an oak. And he acted. He carried her the final 3 miles to his territory. The journey was a blur of pain for Lisa, her consciousness fading in and out against the steady rhythm of his stride. When she finally woke, she was in a small, wood-paneled room that smelled of dried lavender and hearth smoke. Sunlight, weak but warm, filtered through a simple linen curtain. A woman with kind, weathered eyes and a braid of iron-gray hair sat beside the bed, grinding herbs in a mortar. "You're awake," the woman said, her voice like dry leaves. "Good. I'm Clara, the pack healer. Elias brought you in. Your ankle isn't broken, just badly sprained. I've bound it." Lisa pushed herself up on her elbows, a jolt of panic seizing her. She checked her stomach instinctively. "The pup is fine," Clara assured her softly, stopping her grinding. "Heartbeat is strong. Stronger than yours, frankly. You're malnourished and exhausted." Lisa sagged back against the pillows, a breath shuddering past her lips. "Where am I?" "Silver Creek," Clara replied. "Deep in the southern valleys. A quiet place for quiet people." "And the alpha? Elias?" Clara chuckled. "He's more of a stubborn mule than a tyrant. He doesn't meddle in the politics of the high court. He prefers his timber and his peace." Over the next few weeks, Lisa learned the truth of Clara's words. Silver Creek was everything the Citadel wasn't. It was a community built on shared labor rather than hierarchy. The pack members were logging families and farmers, their lives dictated by the seasons rather than court intrigue. They accepted her simply as Ilara, a widow seeking refuge from the harsh northern winters. She helped where she could, sitting with Clara to learn local remedies, sorting dried goods, and mending clothes. The physical work, though tiring, grounded her. The swelling in her belly became more pronounced, a visible testament to the secret she harbored. Elias was a steady, unobtrusive presence. He checked on her occasionally, his gruff demeanor masking a sharp, observant intelligence. He never pressed her for details, but she often caught him watching her, his brow furrowed in quiet calculation. He knew she was running, and he knew she was high-born. The calluses on her hands were new, her posture too rigid for a commoner. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to dust the pine branches outside her window, Elias sat across from her by the hearth fire. "The King's Guard was seen at the edge of the valley 2 days ago," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he stared into the flames. Lisa froze, her needle halting mid-stitch. The warmth of the fire suddenly felt stifling. They were asking questions. Elias continued. "Looking for a woman matching your description. Said she was a thief who stole something valuable from the crown." "I am no thief," Lisa whispered, the lie tasting bitter, though it felt true in her heart. She hadn't stolen anything. She was protecting what was hers. Elias finally looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "I told them we hadn't seen anyone, that the southern passes were snowed in and no one could have made it through." Lisa let out a shaky breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Why would you lie for me, Elias? You risk the king's wrath." "My pack, my territory, my rules," Elias stated simply. "Besides, I know a desperate mother when I see one. A woman doesn't risk a winter crossing unless whatever is behind her is worse than the cold." He stood, knocking the ash from his pipe. "You are safe here, Alara. But the king is relentless. He will not stop searching." Lisa touched her growing stomach, feeling a tiny, fluttery kick against her palm. David was relentless, yes. But he was searching for a discarded mate, a loose end. If he knew the truth of what she carried, the search wouldn't be conducted by guards asking questions. It would be an army tearing the valleys apart. She had to remain hidden. She had to become a ghost. David stood on the balcony of his chambers, staring out at the snow-covered courtyard of the citadel. The air was frigid, biting through his formal tunic, but he welcomed the numbing cold. It was better than the suffocating heat inside. 3 months. 3 months since Lisa had walked out of his study, and 3 months since he had felt the sickening snap of their bond fracturing. He hadn't expected the physical agony of it. The mark on Elena's neck, a stark, angry red, felt like a burning brand on his own soul. It was a necessary cruelty, he reminded himself daily. The Northern Alliance was the only thing standing between his pack and annihilation by the encroaching Eastern rogue factions. Elena brought an army. Lisa brought only a fragile, fading connection. But the silence she left behind was deafening. He had expected anger, perhaps a public denunciation. He had anticipated having to confine her, to manage her fury. He hadn't expected her to vanish like smoke in a gale. "Your Majesty?" David didn't turn as Marcus stepped onto the balcony. The captain of the guard's presence had become a constant, silent reproach. "Report," David commanded, his voice tight. "My scouts have returned from the western ridges," Marcus said, his tone professional, devoid of warmth. "No sign. The winter storms have wiped out any potential trails. The eastern patrols reported similarly 2 days ago." David gripped the stone balustrade, his knuckles turning white. "And the south?" "The southern valleys are vast and uncooperative," Marcus replied carefully. "The local alphas are tight-lipped. They claim ignorance." "They are lying," David growled, the alpha resonance vibrating in his chest. "Someone is hiding her. Someone knows." "Perhaps, sire," Marcus said. "Or perhaps she didn't survive the journey. The wilderness is unforgiving to a lone wolf, especially in winter." The suggestion hit David like a physical blow. He flinched, the sharp, jagged edge of the broken bond twisting in his gut. Dead. The word echoed in his mind, monstrous and impossible. Lisa was strong, fiercely intelligent. She wouldn't just succumb to the elements. "She is not dead," David stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I would feel it. Would you?" The unspoken question hung in the air between them. The bond was so damaged, so clouded by the interference of his new mark, that he couldn't be sure of anything anymore. He only felt a vast, echoing emptiness where she used to be. "Increase the patrols," David ordered, turning finally to face his captain. His silver eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt from lack of sleep. "Offer a bounty. 100 gold pieces for information leading to her whereabouts. Double it if she is brought back alive." Marcus hesitated, his jaw tightening. "A bounty, sire." "You treat her like a fugitive." "She is a fugitive," David snapped, his patience fraying. "She abandoned her king and her pack. She defied my authority. She fled a broken bond, David," Marcus said softly, using the king's given name, a rare liberty. "A bond you broke." The silence on the balcony stretched, tight and brittle. David glared at Marcus, the instinct to command, to dominate, rising in him. But Marcus met his gaze evenly, a soldier who had seen too much and judged him wanting. David looked away first, staring back into the driving snow. The weight of the crown felt heavier than ever, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had secured his borders, allied with a powerful force, and yet his kingdom felt empty. Elena was a competent Luna, sharp and pragmatic, but there was no warmth between them. Their union was a transaction, their interactions carefully choreographed politics. When he lay beside her at night, he found himself reaching for a phantom presence, for the scent of rain and parchment that he could never quite forget. "Just find her, Marcus," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Bring her back." Marcus bowed slightly. "Yes, Your Majesty." As Marcus turned to leave, David added, almost as an afterthought, "And Marcus, tell the scouts to be gentle. She might be fragile." Marcus paused at the door, glancing back at the king. "Fragility is a luxury the hunted rarely afford, sire." He left, leaving David alone with the storm and the ghosts of his own making. The king had made a calculated sacrifice for his people, but he was slowly realizing that the cost might have been his own sanity. Far to the north, within the echoing stone halls of the citadel, Elena poured herself a goblet of dark wine. She did not drink it. Instead, she traced the rim of the silver chalice, her icy blue eyes fixed on the parchment spread across her heavy oak desk. It was a scout's report, one she had intercepted before it could reach the hands of Captain Marcus. Elena was a daughter of the bitter frost, raised in a court where weakness was an invitation for a slit throat. She was practical. She understood David's necessity in marking her, just as she understood the lingering ghosts he battled in the dead of night. She could tolerate his emotional distance. She was a queen, not a love-struck pup. What she could not tolerate was a loose end. The report detailed a faint, nearly imperceptible trace of sapphire silk fibers caught on a briar near the treacherous southern pass. The king's missing mate had not perished in the winter storms, as the court gossips hypothesized. She had fled into the neutral territories. Elena leaned back, the heavy velvet of her gown pooling around her. David was exhausting the kingdom's resources, looking for a woman he claimed to despise for her treason. But Elena saw the truth in his haggard face and his restless pacing. He was obsessed. If he found Lisa, he would bring her back. And a former mate, living in the shadow of the throne, would inevitably fracture the very alliance Elena had forged. Worse, it would undermine her own absolute authority. A shadow peeled itself from the dark corner of her study. The man was massive, heavily scarred, and reeked of damp earth and blood. He was a northern mercenary, loyal only to gold and to the alpha bloodline of the Frost. "You read the coordinates, Kale?" Elena asked, her voice a smooth, deadly purr. "I did, my queen," Kale rumbled. "The southern valleys, Silver Creek territory. The king wants her brought back alive," Elena said, finally picking up her goblet. She took a slow sip, the dark liquid staining her lips. "I, however, recognize that accidents happen in the wilderness. Rogues, wild beasts, a tragic, unavoidable demise." Kale's scarred mouth twisted into a terrible smile. "Understood. The earth will swallow her, and the king will have his closure. Leave tonight," Elena commanded, dropping a heavy pouch of gold onto the desk. "And Kale, make sure it is definitive. I want no whispers of survival." Hundreds of miles south, the brutal grip of winter was finally loosening its hold on Silver Creek. Spring thaw turned the valley into a muddy, vibrant tapestry of new life. Lisa was 8 months pregnant, and the physical toll was staggering. The child within her was not merely growing, it was dominating. It siphoned her strength, demanding nutrients and energy at an alarming rate. It was the undeniable signature of an alpha's bloodline. Powerful, relentless, and heavy. She spent her mornings in the apothecary with Clara, grinding willow bark and organizing dried herbs. Her hands, once soft and manicured for court, were now calloused and stained. Yet she found a strange, grounding peace in the rhythm of the work. "You look like you're carrying a boulder, Elara," Clara observed dryly, handing Lisa a cup of steaming raspberry leaf tea. "That pup is going to come out walking." Lisa managed a tired smile, rubbing her lower back. "It feels like it. He's restless today." "He?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "An intuition," Lisa murmured. She didn't elaborate. She knew it was a boy, and she knew he carried the tempestuous, stormy aura of his father. Needing a moment of quiet, Lisa grabbed a wooden bucket. "I'm going to fetch some fresh water from the eastern stream. The air feels too close in here." Clara frowned, glancing out the window at the dense tree line. "Don't go far. The woods are still waking up. Bears are hungry this time of year." "I'll be right at the edge," Lisa promised, throwing a heavy shawl over her shoulders. The walk to the stream was short, but it left her winded. She knelt awkwardly by the rushing water, the icy spray dampening her face. She plunged the bucket in, watching the current swirl around the wood. Then, the wind shifted. The scent hit her nostrils, sharp and entirely out of place in the fragrant spring woods. It was the smell of old blood, wet dog, and the bitter tang of the northern frost. It was not a bear. Lisa froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't turn around. She slowly let go of the bucket, letting the current take it, her hand creeping toward the small silver blade she still kept concealed in her skirts. "Well now," a gravelly voice sneered from the tree line behind her. "The little runaway queen. You look vastly different than the portraits in the citadel." Lisa slowly stood, turning to face the intruder. Kyle stepped out from the shadows of the pines, a jagged hunting knife in his hand. He didn't look like a king's guardsman. He looked like an executioner. "I am a widow of this pack," Lisa lied smoothly, lifting her chin despite the terror freezing her blood. "You are trespassing on Silver Creek territory." Kyle laughed, a harsh, barking sound. His eyes dropped to her swollen belly, widening in sudden realization. Well, the king doesn't just have a runaway mate. He has a runaway heir. Queen Elena will pay triple for this news, or rather, for preventing it from ever reaching him. He lunged. Lisa tried to step back, but her heavy, clumsy body betrayed her. She stumbled on the muddy bank. Before Kale could close the distance, a massive blur of silver and black erupted from the underbrush. A wolf, larger than any Lisa had ever seen, slammed into Kale with the force of a falling redwood. The mercenary was thrown backward, crashing into a tree with a sickening crunch. The silver wolf stood over him, lips pulled back in a terrifying, thunderous snarl, saliva dripping from inch-long fangs. It was Elias. And he was not merely a lumberjack. He was a prime, dominant alpha, radiating a murderous intent that suffocated the air. Kyle scrambled backward, clutching his broken ribs, terror finally replacing his arrogance. Elias didn't shift back to human form. He didn't need to. He stepped forward, placing a massive paw heavily on Kyle's chest, pinning him to the muddy earth. The alpha's glowing yellow eyes locked onto the mercenary, silently demanding answers. Kyle, coughing up blood, rasped out his final, spiteful words. "The Northern Queen. She sent me. I'm not The only one. Elias's jaws snapped shut, ending the threat with brutal, efficient finality. He then turned his massive head toward Lisa. She was trembling violently, arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. Elias shifted back, reaching for the spare tunic he had left on a branch. His face was grim, a storm brewing in his dark eyes. "Go back to the cabin, Ilara," he commanded, his voice vibrating with alpha resonance. "Now, we are under attack." The tranquility of Silver Creek shattered like ice under a heavy boot. Elias didn't wait for Lisa to explain. He practically carried her back to Clara's cabin, bellowing orders that echoed through the valley. Within minutes, the peaceful logging community transformed. Men and women dropped their tools and emerged from their homes bearing heavy axes, hunting rifles, and the fierce, protective aura of a cornered pack. "They are northern rogues, mercenaries," Elias told his seconds as they barricaded the main pathways. "They are here for Ilara. No one breaches the perimeter." Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was suffocating with panic. Clara was frantically gathering medical supplies, shoving them into a heavy satchel. "I have to leave," Lisa gasped, pacing the small room, her hands gripping her hair. "Elias, I brought this war to your doorstep. If I leave now, they will follow me. Your people will be safe." Elias turned from the window, his expression harder than carved granite. "You are not leaving. You are packed now. Silver Creek does not abandon its own, especially not a mother carrying a pup. You stay in the root cellar with Clara, and you stay quiet." "But they will slaughter you," Lisa cried out. "Let them try," Elias growled, his eyes flashing wolf yellow. "They underestimate southern timber wolves." Night fell quickly, bringing with it a freezing spring rain that turned the mud into a slick, treacherous battleground. From the damp, earthen darkness of the root cellar beneath Clara's cabin, Lisa listened to the nightmare unfolding above. At first, there was only the sound of the rain and her own ragged breathing. Then, the silence was ripped apart by a chorus of terrifying howls, followed immediately by the clash of steel, the sickening thud of bodies colliding, and the screams of men and wolves. Lisa curled into a ball on a pile of burlap sacks, her hands clamped over her ears. Every crash above sent a jolt of terror through her. She had spent months hiding, trying to protect her child from the political machinations of the crown, only to drag him into a literal bloodbath. Suddenly, a massive shudder racked her body. It wasn't fear. It was physical. A searing, blinding pain clamped down on her lower abdomen, pulling her breath from her lungs in a sharp gasp. Clara, who had been peering through the floorboards, dropped to her knees beside Lisa. In the dim light of a single lantern, the healer's face went pale. "Ilara?" Clara touched her arm. Lisa couldn't speak. She doubled over as another contraction ripped through her, infinitely stronger than the false labor pains she had experienced weeks ago. Warmth flooded her thighs, soaking through her heavy wool skirt. "My water," Lisa choked out, her fingernails biting into Clara's wrist. "It's too early. It's a month too early." "The stress," Clara muttered, instantly shifting into her healer role. She dragged blankets from a chest and positioned Lisa on her back. The shock triggered it. The pup knows the mother is in danger. It's trying to escape. Above them, something heavy crashed onto the floorboards, raining dust down upon them. A feral snarl vibrated through the wood. The battle was right above their heads. "You have to breathe, Ilara," Clara ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I know it's early, but you have to push when I tell you. If we don't get this pup out quickly, the stress will kill you both." Lisa nodded frantically, tears mixing with the sweat on her face. As the next contraction hit, she bit down on her own hand to keep from screaming, pushing with every ounce of strength her battered body possessed. Hundreds of miles away, in the high court of the Citadel, Alpha King David was presiding over a tense late-night war council. The eastern borders were flaring up again, and Elena's generals were arguing over troop deployments. David sat at the head of the massive obsidian table, his expression unreadable. He hadn't slept properly in months. The hollow ache in his chest, the space where his mate bond used to be, was a constant companion. Suddenly, mid-sentence, David stopped. A sharp, electric jolt shot through his spine. He gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning instantly white. "Your Majesty?" Marcus, standing by the door, took a step forward. David couldn't hear him. The hollow emptiness in his chest had suddenly ignited. It wasn't the warmth of a repaired bond. It was an explosion of pure, unadulterated agony. It was raw terror, physical pain, and a desperate, clawing need to survive. It was Lisa. The severed ends of their bond, frayed and deadened by distance and his new mark, were violently sparking back to life, forced open by a surge of monumental trauma on the other end. David gasped, falling forward against the table, upending a goblet of wine. The room fell dead silent. Elena stood up, her eyes narrowing. "David, what is it?" He couldn't answer. A secondary sensation slammed into him, so powerful it drove him to his knees. Beneath the blinding pain of Lisa's terror, a new rhythm emerged. A heartbeat. It was frantic, thundering through the phantom connection like a war drum. It carried the undeniable, tempestuous signature of his own blood, his own soul. It was an Alpha's aura, entirely new, yet fiercely familiar. An heir. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't just run from his betrayal. She had run to protect his child, his heir. And right now, in this exact second, she was fighting for her life, and the life of their pup. "David!" Elena shouted, moving toward him. David's head snapped up. His eyes weren't silver. They were a blinding, luminescent gold. The absolute apex of alpha dominance, a terrifying manifestation of primal instinct that hadn't been seen in generations. "Get away from me." His voice was not human. It was a demonic, reverberating roar that shook the very foundations of the war room. The glass in the tall windows spiderwebbed and shattered. He didn't wait for his guards. He didn't issue commands to his generals. The Alpha King turned and launched himself through the shattered window into the freezing night. He shifted midair, a massive, midnight black wolf, hitting the courtyard stones with earth-shattering force. He didn't need trackers anymore. The screaming, bleeding tether in his soul acted as a beacon. He tore through the Citadel gates, a blur of shadow and fury, heading due south. Behind him, Marcus didn't hesitate. The captain of the guard drew his sword, yelled an order to his elite unit, and gave chase. The king was going to war. The forest blurred into a tunnel of dark, rushing shadows. Alpha King David did not run. He became a force of nature, a midnight black missile tearing through the frozen spring mud. The sheer velocity of his sprint was tearing the pads of his paws, his lungs burning with every massive intake of freezing air. But he felt none of it. The only thing he felt was the chaotic, agonizing symphony echoing through the resurrected mate bond. It was a connection he had believed irreparably dormant, suffocated beneath the suffocating weight of his political union with Elena. Now, it was a live wire of raw terror and blinding physical pain. He could feel Lisa's agony as if it were his own, every contraction ripping through his own abdomen in sympathetic resonance. And beneath it all, that small, frantic, thundering second heartbeat, his child, fighting for entry into a world currently trying to murder its mother. Hold on. Just hold on. He projected through the tether, though he didn't know if she could hear him over the static of her pain. Miles behind him, Marcus and the elite guard were pushing their own limits, but they were already losing ground. David was tapping into a primordial well of alpha strength that defied biological logic. The trees parted before his aura, the nocturnal predators fleeing deeper into the brush, terrified of the apex force barreling south. Meanwhile, beneath the floorboards of Clara's cabin in Silver Creek, time had distilled into singular moments of unbearable agony. "Push, Alara, again!" Clara's voice was hoarse, her hands slick with blood and amniotic fluid. Lisa screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore her throat. She arched her back off the damp burlap, her fingers digging so fiercely into the dirt floor that her nails cracked. The air in the cellar was thick, smelling of earth, copper, and sweat. Above them, the battle raged with terrifying proximity. The heavy thud of a body hitting the floorboards sent a shower of dust raining down onto Lisa's face. She heard the scratching of claws, the sickening crunch of bone, and a distinctly human scream cut short. "I can't," Lisa sobbed, her head falling back. Exhaustion was a heavy, suffocating blanket dragging her under. "Clara, they are right above us. They will not breach this cellar, and you will not give up," Clara commanded, her tone brooking no argument. She grabbed a cold, damp rag and wiped Lisa's forehead. "The crown may have broken your heart, child, but it did not break your spine. You are a mother now. The pup's head is crowning. On the next contraction, you give me everything you have left." Another crash shook the ceiling. Heavy boots pounded directly above the trapdoor. A muffled, heavily accented voice shouted, "Check beneath. They said she was in the main cabin." Panic, icy and sharp, pierced through the fog of Lisa's pain. They were out of time. The contraction hit with the force of a tidal wave. Lisa didn't bite her hand this time. She let out a fierce, breathless scream, channeling every ounce of her terror, her betrayal, and her fierce maternal instinct into one continuous, agonizing push. The darkness behind her eyes exploded into stars. And then, the pressure vanished. A sudden, startling silence seemed to fall over the cellar, broken a microsecond later by a sound that made the entire world stop spinning. A cry. It was a thin, reedy wail that rapidly gained strength, echoing off the earthen walls with startling volume. It was the sound of life, defiant and demanding. Clara let out a breathless, triumphant laugh, swiftly clearing the infant's airway. "A boy," she whispered, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she wrapped the thrashing, purple-hued newborn in a clean linen towel. A strong, furious little boy. She laid the bundled child on Lisa's chest. The moment Lisa felt the wet, solid warmth of him, the agonizing pain of the last hour evaporated into a profound, overwhelming clarity. She wrapped her trembling arms around him, burying her face in the towel, inhaling the metallic, sweet scent of her son. He was tiny, a month premature, but his aura, even now, crackled with a nascent, static energy. "My beautiful boy," she wept, pressing a kiss to his damp, dark hair. But the sanctuary of the moment was violently shattered. The hinges of the trapdoor above them shrieked as they were brutally wrenched upward. Dirt and splinters rained down as the heavy wooden door was ripped completely off its hinges. A mercenary leaned over the opening, a lantern swinging from his grip, illuminating the bloody scene below. He saw the exhausted woman, He saw the crying infant. A cruel, victorious grin split his scarred face, and he raised a loaded crossbow, pointing it directly into the cellar. "Found the runaway," he yelled over his shoulder. He leveled the weapon at Lisa's chest. "Queen Elena sends her regards." Lisa curled entirely over her son, shielding his tiny body with her own, closing her eyes and waiting for the end. The bolt never fired. Before the mercenary's finger could depress the trigger, the entire front wall of Clara's cabin exploded inward. It wasn't broken. It was obliterated, logs and mortar detonating into a deadly shower of shrapnel as a massive, midnight black entity crashed through it. The mercenary above the trapdoor only had time to turn his head before a set of jaws clamped around his torso. The crossbow clattered uselessly to the floorboards as the man was lifted effortlessly into the air and thrown backward through a shattered window, his scream fading into the night. Down in the cellar, Lisa flinched at the deafening crash, clutching her screaming son tighter. She looked up through the open hatch. The battle above had instantly ceased. The remaining mercenaries froze, their weapons dropping from slack hands as they stared at the monstrous wolf standing amidst the wreckage of the cabin. It was David. He was twice the size of a standard timber wolf, his fur matted with mud and the blood of those he had torn through to get here. But it was his eyes that paralyzed the room. They were not their usual stormy silver. They were burning, incandescent gold. The aura radiating from him was not merely dominant, it was apocalyptic. The air pressure in the room dropped so violently that the surviving mercenaries dropped to their knees, gasping for breath, physically crushed by the sheer weight of his presence. David didn't bark. He didn't snarl. The silence of his fury was infinitely more terrifying. He moved with blinding speed. The 3 remaining northern rogues in the cabin were dispatched with a brutal, surgical efficiency that spoke of an ancient, feral instinct unleashed. There was no prolonged fight. There was only execution. When the cabin was clear, the golden eyes snapped toward the open trapdoor. Lisa backed away, pressing herself against the far earthen wall, the silver blade now clutched in her right hand while her left arm cradled her child. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was terrified, not of the mercenaries, but of the monster staring down at her. David shifted. The transformation was rapid, tearing through his clothes until he stood naked and gasping at the edge of the opening. He was covered in blood, his chest heaving, his silver eyes returning wide and desperate. He dropped into the cellar without using the ladder, landing heavily on the dirt floor. "Stay back," Lisa warned, her voice trembling but her grip on the knife steady. She held the blade up, angling it toward the Alpha King. David froze. He looked at the knife, then at her pale, tear-streaked face. And finally, his gaze dropped to the small, squirming bundle pressed against her chest. A choked, fractured sound escaped his throat. It was the sound of a king breaking. He fell to his knees in the dirt, heedless of the blood and amniotic fluid soaking the floor. The imposing, terrifying Alpha, who had just decimated a squad of armed men, was gone. In his place was a man unraveling. "Lisa," he whispered, extending a trembling, blood-stained hand toward her, but stopping inches away, afraid to cross the boundary of her blade. "You're bleeding? You're—" "God, Lisa, because of you," she spat, the venom returning to her voice now that the immediate threat of death had passed. The adrenaline was keeping her upright. These were northern rogues, Elena's men. They came to execute me and your secret heir so she wouldn't have to share her throne. The revelation struck David like a physical blow. He rocked back on his heels, the color draining from his face. The pieces slammed together in his mind. The intercepted scout reports, Elena's sudden interest in troop deployments, the mercenaries carrying northern steel. His political bride had tried to slaughter his true mate and his unborn child. "I didn't know," David rasped, his voice cracking. "I swear to you on my life, Lisa. I didn't know." "It doesn't matter what you knew," Lisa said, pulling the baby closer as he let out a quiet fuss. "Your choices brought them here. Your public marking of another woman severed my protection. You made me a target. You made him a target." David looked at the infant. The tether in his chest pulled taut, singing with a profound, terrifying love he had never experienced. "My son," he breathed, the words reverent. "My son," Lisa corrected sharply. "You traded your rights to him for a northern army." Before David could respond, a shadow fell over the trapdoor. Elias peered down, his arm bleeding sluggishly, his breathing heavy. "The perimeter is secure," Elias reported, his dark eyes fixed on David. He didn't bow. "Your men just arrived, King David. They are rounding up the stragglers. But if you make a sudden move toward Alara, I will drop you where you kneel." David looked up at the Southern Alpha. A week ago, he would have demanded the man's head for such insolence. Now, he simply nodded. "You protected them," David said softly. "I owe you a life debt, Elias of Silver Creek." "You owe her," Elias corrected gruffly. "She's the one who survived." He looked at Clara. "We need to get them out of this damp hole. My cabin is still standing." David stood, immediately reaching to lift Lisa. "Don't touch me." She flinched away, the blade flashing. The phantom pain of the broken bond flared between them, a stark reminder of the spiritual violence he had committed. David swallowed hard, the rejection carving another hollow into his soul. He stepped back, raising his hands in surrender. Okay, I won't touch you. But let Clara and Elias help you up. Please." The morning sun broke over Silver Creek, illuminating a valley scarred by violence, but ultimately unbowed. Inside Elias's cabin, a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Lisa lay exhausted in a large, comfortable bed, the baby sleeping soundly against her collarbone, his tiny fists curled tight. The bleeding had stopped, and Clara had assured her that both she and the pup were healthy, if entirely drained. David sat in a wooden chair in the far corner of the room. He had washed the blood from his skin and borrowed a simple linen shirt and trousers from Elias. He looked entirely out of place without his royal finery, stripped down to nothing but a weary, shattered man. He hadn't slept, keeping a silent, watchful vigil over the bed. Marcus entered the cabin quietly, his armor clinking. He cast a respectful glance at Lisa before approaching the king. "The last of the mercenaries have been dealt with, sire," Marcus reported in a low voice. Under interrogation, one confirmed Elena's direct orders and payment. The northern troops at our borders were a distraction to ensure our elite guard was occupied, while the assassins moved south. David didn't look away from Lisa. "Treason. High treason, Your Majesty," Marcus agreed. "The Northern Alliance is effectively null and void." "What are your orders?" "We have enough men here to safely escort the Queen, pardon, Lady Lisa, and the Prince back to the Citadel." "No." Lisa's voice was weak, but the iron resolve in it cut through the room. She shifted slightly, waking the baby who let out a small mule. "I will not raise my son in a castle built on lies and shared with a woman who tried to murder him." David finally looked at her, his expression a portrait of profound grief. "Elena will not be there, Lisa. She will be stripped of her title, her mark forcefully rejected, and she will be sent back to the north in chains to await execution for treason. I will tear the citadel down to the foundations to make it safe for you. And the mark on your soul? Lisa asked quietly, the question devastating in its simplicity. Can you tear that down, David? Even if you reject her, the scar remains. The bond we had. You broke it. You shattered it in front of thousands. I was a fool, David admitted, his voice breaking. He stood and walked to the edge of the bed, dropping to his knees. He didn't care that Marcus was watching, or that Elias was standing by the door. The pride of the Alpha King had burned away in the fires of last night's terror. I thought I was choosing the survival of our people. I was arrogant enough to believe I could sacrifice our bond for peace. But without you, I was a king of ashes. He looked at his son, his golden eyes softening with a desperate, aching love. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot unmark her without immense physical and spiritual pain. But I will endure it. I will bear the scar. I am not asking you to forgive me, Lisa. I am not asking you to return to the citadel as my queen. Lisa frowned, confusion briefly replacing her anger. Then what are you saying? Marcus, David said, not taking his eyes off Lisa. Draft a royal decree. The Northern Alliance is dissolved. Elena is to be arrested immediately by the remaining guard at the capital. Furthermore, he took a shaky breath. The seat of the Alpha King is hereby relocated. The citadel is to be governed by a ruling council. Marcus gasped, stepping forward. Sire, you cannot mean... I mean exactly that, David stated, his voice firming with absolute authority. He looked back at Lisa. I am staying here, in Silver Creek, if Elias will grant me sanctuary. Elias, leaning against the doorframe, raised an eyebrow but remained silent. You would give up the citadel? Lisa asked, stunned. For what? For the chance to be a father, David said, tears finally spilling over his lashes. For the chance to prove to you that my soul belongs to you, and only you, even if it takes the rest of my life to rebuild the bridge I burned. I will sleep in the dirt outside this cabin. I will chop wood. I will be nothing but a guard dog for this pack if it means I can be near you and him. He slowly reached out, his hand trembling, and gently brushed a finger against his son's impossibly small cheek. The infant shifted, letting out a soft sigh, and a tiny, fragile spark of warmth flared along the deadened lines of the mate bond in Lisa's chest. It wasn't a roaring fire. It wasn't the absolute, unshakable trust they had once shared. It was a single, hesitant ember. Lisa looked at the man kneeling before her. Stripped of his crown, his pride, and his kingdom, offering everything for a second chance. She didn't forgive him. The betrayal was still too raw, the danger still too recent. But as David withdrew his hand and looked at her with desperate, penitent eyes, she didn't tell him to leave. You can start by chopping the firewood, Lisa said softly, looking down at her sleeping son. Clara says the winters here are brutal. David let out a ragged breath that sounded halfway between a sob and a laugh. He bowed his head, resting his forehead against the edge of the mattress. Thank you. Thank you, my mate. The road ahead was not a fairy tale. The political fallout of David's choices would echo across the territories, and the scars of a broken bond would take years to heal. But as the morning light poured into the cabin, illuminating the weary parents and the tiny, slumbering heir, the shadows of the past finally began to recede, making way for a fiercely protected future. Thank you for reading The Alpha King publicly marked another woman. But his true mate was carrying the last royal heir. If you enjoyed this journey of betrayal, intense emotional stakes, and the fierce lengths a mother will go to protect her child. Please like, share, and subscribe for more gripping Alpha King romances and dramatic fiction. What did you think of David's ultimate sacrifice at the end? Let us know in the comments below, and stay tuned for our next cinematic story.